You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 190, The Fall of France, Stonne and Flavigny's Failure. This week, a big thank you goes out to CoinWalk Dualizer, George, and Charles for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. They now get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes released once a month. This month's episode is on the design and development of the Hawker Hurricane. If that sounds interesting to you, head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. When considering the French reaction to the German bridgeheads over the Meuse, it's important to make a distinction between what they were trying to do and what they actually did. This is because the basic theory behind their reactions, which they called colmatage, which translates into English as plugging or sealing or clogging, it was essentially a method of sending units forward to seal off any German penetrations, to halt their advance, and then maybe even to roll back some of their gains through counterattacks. And while there's always some amount of variance, this is exactly or almost exactly how every other army at this point in time would have reacted to what was happening. They even had, the French that is, the reserves positioned at the divisional, the corps, the army, and the army group levels to make this happen, as we've discussed on 2 different occasions over the past 2 episodes. So if the theory was sound, why did they fail? Failures that this episode will discuss in more detail. The problem was one of execution, particularly by the French motorized and mechanized divisions. Because of the nature of the German breakthroughs, the French troops best prepared to counteract them were the French armored and motorized units. But they had a problem. They were equipped with vehicles that in many cases were completely unable to fulfill this function. The Char B-1 tanks that most of the counterattacking units were equipped with were hopelessly slow at moving around the battlefield, requiring constant fueling and maintenance. This made it very challenging for the French units to react quick enough to the situation at any given moment, which provided a tremendous advantage to the German units who were largely equipped with more mobile vehicles. An interesting parallel could actually be drawn to the changes in the panzer divisions throughout the war, because while they started off the war with some of the most mobile tanks on the battlefield, by the time you get to late war designs like the Tiger, which was sort of in use, in the last 3 years of the war, the Germans would actually suffer from the same problems that the French did in 1940. Sort of their most important and most powerful armored vehicle couldn't move around as fast as the enemy armored vehicles that it was designed to counter. It turns out that very large heavy tanks, which get poor fuel mileage, have limited mobility due to their weight, and have a tendency to break down, will always have a challenging time reacting to a more mobile opponent. For the French in 1940, what did not help the situation was the fact that at the highest level of French command, there was a general denial about how dire the situation was, with Gamelin referring to the German troops at Sedan as merely a local interlude as late as May 14th, a day after they had established their bridgeheads. This was problematic because while there were counterattacking forces positioned for all of the French units in the area, there were a finite number of them in the immediate vicinity of the attack, and once they had been committed, it was critical that more units flow in to fill the gaps left by those that had already been used. Those troops could only come from French high command, and if they were going to be moved, it had to be quickly due to the mobility challenges that they were already having. The denial of how bad the situation was or how dangerous the German troops were also meant that troops further north, the British and the French forces in Belgium, did not react as they would if they thought they were about to be cut off from the rest of France. And oh, by the way, over the next 5 days, and for us about 3 episodes, they will be cut off from the rest of France. But last episode covered the failed counterattacks launched by General Lafontaine near Sedan on May 14th. But even before those counterattacks were a failure, additional French counterattack divisions were being ordered to move into position to launch the next round of French counterattacks. This was still a relatively local effort. It was pulling on troops roughly in the vicinity of the attack, but they were larger than what had been given to Lafontaine. If Lafontaine's counterattacks had went well, again, these were ordered before his had failed, and he had stopped the German advance, then the troops that were about to attack, that we're going to talk about throughout this episode, would have been perfectly positioned to push the Germans back to the Meuse. But if Lafontaine's counterattacks went poorly, which they did, as we covered last episode, then these would be the next units sort of pushed into the breach. This next set of French forces that were moving forward were the 21st Corps, under the command of General Jean-Adolphe Louis Robert Flavigny. The 21st Corps had started the war as merely a corps on paper, with no divisions actually assigned to it, and it was basically just a corps headquarters, sort of awaiting actual divisions. Eventually, 3 divisions would be provided to the Corps: the 3rd Armored, the 3rd Motorized, and the 5th Light Cavalry Division. Flavigny was widely considered to be France's expert on armored warfare, and he had been given the command of the 3 divisions, and much was expected of him. These divisions had been positioned on the northern edge of the Maginot Line, due to the French belief that one of the primary goals of any German attack at Sedan would be to sweep south to get behind the line of French defenses that made up the Maginot Line. This fear that the Germans would try to outflank the Maginot Line was a major contributor to why the French forces south of Sedan were some of the best equipped and trained forces anywhere, or at least the ones that weren't driving into central Belgium. Unfortunately, this was not really the case with the 21st Corps. The 3 divisions that made up the unit were in a generally rough state for many reasons. The 3rd Armored Division had only been formed in March 1940, which did not give the division much time to gel and to train and to become a division. It was also missing some of the key elements of an armored division, particularly when it came to maintenance units, which was quite problematic given the relative lack of reliability of some of the French vehicles. When looking at the division's order of battle, about the only thing that it was not short of was tanks, which was good if they could get them successfully deployed into battle. To give a good example of the state of the 3rd Armored, we can look at the French Army's own decision on May 10th, the start of the German invasion, to not even put the division on alert, and instead allow it to continue its training regimen due to the fear that disrupting that training would simply further delay the division's ability to grow into a fully functional piece of the French army. The 2nd division that was part of the 21st Corps was the 5th Light Cavalry Division. It had a lot more training, it had a lot more experience, and it had even been involved in the earlier fighting against the German forces as they had advanced across southern Belgium. Unfortunately, those actions had cost the division many of its men and much of its material, which had greatly eroded its combat power. So the 3rd Motorized, the 3rd Division, was the only unit that was really fully prepared for the operation ahead. But at the very least, they were positioned in a decent area, with their holding positions being behind the northern areas of the Maginot Line. This placed the 21st Corps in an excellent position to attack north and into the left flank of Guderian's forces as they were advancing out of Sedan. At 7 p.m. on May 13th, just a few hours after the first of Guderian's forces had crossed the river, these troops of the 21st Corps were given an order to prepare for a counterattack, with the 3rd Motorized and 3rd Armored, along with the 5th Light Cavalry Division in support. Then, at around midnight, they were given their official orders, with the plan being for them to advance to a line centered on the village of Stonne, and from there to launch a counterattack directly into Sedan. These orders from above were translated by Flavigny's headquarters into orders that would head down the chain of command to his forces, and these sort of filtered orders down the chain of command would arrive at most units by about 4 a.m. on the 14th, under the title Operations Order No. 1. The basic outline of the attack, with the French units first moving up to a position to halt the German advance before they drove deeper into the German bridgehead, was completely reasonable. It was a good approach as any to the operation. However, it was one that generally played into the hands of the Germans for 2 reasons. The first was that the French units that had already tried to counterattack had proven how difficult it could be to launch 2 successive attacks, with the disorganization present in any attempt to stop the German advance, causing issues when the units then tried to launch their own counterattack. The second was that French doctrine called for a relatively methodical approach to any attack, which would allow the Germans more time to respond to French actions, and the Germans had proven and would prove to be great at responding to French action. Regardless of any problems experienced by the French or the inexperience of their units involved, the equipment that was committed to the attack was nothing to scoff at. Between his various forces, the 3rd Armored, the 3rd Motorized, and then the 5th Light Cavalry Division, there were a good number of tanks, around 300 in total. These were split between Char B1s and these smaller Hotchkiss tanks, which were a little bit more mobile. They would be facing far more German tanks than that, just overall, which sort of, if you look at all of the tanks under Guderian's command, but the numbers are not nearly as bad as you might expect. First of all, not all of Guderian's tanks would be in position for the attack, and over the course of 5 days of the campaign, many of the German tanks had either been disabled in combat or were unavailable due to maintenance problems. This meant that at the time of the French attack, there were probably under 875 functional tanks in Guderian's entire Panzer Corps. On top of this, many of the tanks were Panzer Is and IIs, which were no match for the French forces, and many of the tanks were doing other things, rather than just sitting and waiting for the French to attack. It was really only the 10th Panzer which would be positioned to counter the French threat, with the 1st and 2nd Panzer divisions either preparing to or already on their way west. This was both a good and a bad thing for the French at that moment. The good news was that the German bridgehead was weaker than it would be in the future, and the French were going to attack when it was quite weak, with troops still streaming across the river and 2 of the 3 German armored divisions dedicated to running away from it as quickly as possible, essentially. The only troops really positioned to stop the French were the 10th Panzer and then Infantry Regiment Grossdeutschland, which had already been involved in heavy fighting during the crossings. That was the good news. The German forces were kind of strung out. They were not perfectly positioned. The bad news was that if the counterattack failed, the French would be in a much greater position of danger because they had used their strongest counterattack force in the area to attack the bridgehead instead of trying to halt the advance of the 1st and 2nd Panzer. It was a gamble. If it paid off, they could stop the German armored forces entirely by cutting off their supply. If it didn't, there would be 2 German armored divisions moving west, and the strongest French counterattack forces in the area had been used on an operation that had failed. I guess technically this is spoilers, but this risk, this gamble, it would not pay off. And one of the reasons that it would not pay off was because it would be delayed. The original plan was for Flavigny's counterattack to begin in the late morning of May 14th. But even this was a compromise, with Flavigny originally hoping that it could begin even earlier. However, he was talked into a delay until 11 a.m. due to how long it would take to refuel and prepare all of his vehicles. The delay would allow about 4 hours for the units to refuel and then 2 hours for them to move forward to their jumping off points. General Brocard, the commander of the 3rd Armored Division, immediately registered his concern that his force would not be ready on that timeline. His forces had not even fully moved out of the area around Reims, and so they needed hours before they would even arrive at the refueling point, and only then could the process really begin. The biggest problem was that most of the division had to move forward 50 kilometers before they could even begin the process of resupply. Then they had to advance another 15 kilometers to their jumping off points. All of that movement would take additional time. This meant that the earliest that the attack could happen was 4 p.m., another 5 hours of delay. I've already discussed at length the problem of fuel consumption among the French tanks, but just to add some additional depth here, this short-range problem was a known problem when the tank was being designed, but an additional fuel tank that had originally been in those designs was cut out to reduce cost. And the fuel consumption problem was compounded by the fact that the batteries in the tank could only be charged by the engine. This meant that if the crews wanted to use things like a radio, which was a pretty important bit of kit, they had to keep the engines running. Oh, and finally, the fuel that these tanks used was not normal gasoline. It was not normal diesel, but instead it had to be high-grade aviation fuel that was also used in aircraft engines, which made resupply even more challenging because they couldn't just dump in what they used in all the other vehicles. All of these challenges just forced more delays, although Flavigny insisted that everything be done as fast as possible with a new launch time of the attack at 1 p.m. in the afternoon. This new deadline would once again prove to be too optimistic, as it would fly by without the French attack being launched. The 3rd Armored Division was simply too slow to get into position, and as the hours drug on without any option, Flavigny was faced with a choice. He could continue with the plan to launch the counterattack on the 14th, or he could delay until the 15th. If he attacked on the 14th, it was very likely that the attack would not even begin until the early evening, which would result in fighting in the dark. Due to the fear of the chaos that such an action would cause among French forces, Flavigny instead decided to delay the attack until early on the 15th. This decision was not taken lightly, but given the actions of the 3rd Armored Division on the 14th and their apparent lack of real vigor to get into the fighting, Flavigny was concerned that a disorganized attack would be an abject failure. And so instead, the forces under his command would be dispersed into defensive positions for the night, with the goal of an attack the next day. Flavigny has come under a lot of criticism for this decision, as many see this exact moment and this exact decision made on the afternoon of the 14th as the last real chance that the French had to halt the developing disaster. He would later say that he made the decision because disaster was exactly what he was trying to avoid. The risks, in his opinion, were simply too high. He would say later in the war that, quote, "It seemed impossible to make the counterattack before night. An attack led by weak, poorly trained troops seemed to be doomed to a failure that could have compromised the defense of Montdieu," end quote. Montdieu being the area that the troops sort of dispersed into to defend against a possible German attack. This is one of those decisions where Flavigny, he wasn't wrong. It's very possible that the counterattack could have been a disaster, but by delaying it, he also helped to ensure the disaster of the days that followed. All of this was compounded by the fact that the forces of the 3rd Armor were spread out into a series of defensive lines, and they would never be concentrated again, which sacrificed whatever benefit such a strong French armored formation could have provided. The attack was a risk, but it was a risk that the French army desperately needed Flavigny to take, even if it had a high chance of failure. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Do you have self-care non-negotiables? I take a walk every day. Rain, shine, snow, it's happening. Maybe therapy needs to be one of those things. Maybe one of your days needs to be a therapy day. But it's sometimes hard to add yet another thing to the calendar, and that's where BetterHelp comes in. BetterHelp is entirely online, so you can do it from the coziness of your own home, or from anywhere else, for that matter. To get started, all you have to do is fill out a questionnaire, which will help match you with a licensed therapist. You can then switch therapists at any time. It's flexible, it's convenient, and it's just a few clicks away. So never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/WWII today to get 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/WWII. The failure of the French to launch a counterattack was critical to the success of the attacks of Guderian's forces. Even though his strongest mobile forces were already on the move west, it was still important that the left flank of that advance be guarded, with the threat of a French counterattack always present and concerning. To try and minimize the problem, the 10th Panzer Division was pushed further south, with the goal of arriving at the areas around the village of Stonne. The hope was that the German line could be anchored on the high ground around Stonne, which would allow the 10th Panzer to quickly be replaced by other forces so that it could rejoin the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions in their movements west. However, the future of those movements west were in doubt on the morning of the 15th. This doubt all came back to the disagreement between the different groups of German generals and how they each believed that the attack should develop after the river was crossed. There were some influential members of German high command that advocated for a more cautious strategy, and they wanted Guderian's forces to focus on just holding the bridgehead until infantry arrived. Only after those infantry forces arrived would they then begin another attack with their armored units. In this case, it would be the other group, led by Guderian, who advocated for an immediate attack by the 1st and 2nd Panzer that would win this argument, thanks partially to the support of General Halder. Their argument was a good one, because an immediate attack would allow the Germans to keep the initiative and to keep the French off balance. If they halted, even for a few days, it was very possible that the French would have time to rush in reinforcements to solidify the front, and then they would once again have to try and execute a costly breakthrough maneuver. It might also give a French counterattack time to happen, which in this case it would have. I keep bringing up these disagreements, and they will resurface multiple times in the next few episodes, because in many ways it would be the defining factor of the German campaign after the armored forces had successfully crossed the Meuse. On one side, you had the more aggressive generals who wanted to push forward as quickly as possible, while at the same time other officers argued for caution, out of concern that the rapidly advancing armored spearheads could be cut off by French counterattacks. These arguments would become much more complicated once Hitler would get involved in the days after May 15th. But all of that was in the future though, when on the afternoon of May 14th, with Flavigny still trying to get his counterattack sorted out, Guderian would order the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions to attack west towards Rethel, an advance of around 40 kilometers, and the first step of many in the days that would follow, leading eventually to the English Channel. While the German armored divisions were already moving, on the morning of 15th, another French counterattack was planned using the forces that Flavigny had brought forward the day before. Hunziker would give the orders to Flavigny at 8:30 a.m. on the morning of the 15th, and then Flavigny brought together the commanders of the 3rd Armored Division and 3rd Motorized Infantry Division, which he had under his command. This meeting did not occur until 10 a.m., and at that meeting, the deadline for the attack was set at 2 p.m. And you're never going to guess what happened next. The attack got delayed. First to 4 p.m., then to 6:30 p.m., and then at 6:15 it was canceled. There were two core problems that once again caused another possible French counterattack to be delayed and then canceled. Fuel was once again a challenge, for all the same reasons that it was the day before, with the commander of the 3rd Armored, General Brocard, saying that, quote, suicide mission or no suicide mission, the tanks cannot move without gas, end quote. Just as importantly, after the final cancellation of the attack on the 14th, the forces had been widely dispersed into defensive positions, and concentrating them back together just took more time than expected. It simply took time for orders to be passed around and then for the physical movement of men and machines, particularly in situations where fuel was already a problem. The second major problem was the fact that by the time that the orders started to go out for the counterattack, some of the units that were supposed to launch that counterattack were already fighting Germans. We will discuss some of that fighting here in just a moment, but it was of course always challenging for units to disengage from the fighting and prepare for a counterattack somewhere else. The failure of Flavigny's forces to do anything would receive a lot of criticism, and General Brocard would be made the scapegoat, being relieved of command of the 3rd Armored Division. But there's plenty of blame to go around throughout the entirety of French command around the Sedan area. This situation would lead the British author Lynn Dayton to say that the French army, quote, had been defeated by its own commanders, which I think about sums things up. Because of the French failures to launch their counterattack and the German desire to secure the left flank of the advance of the 2 armored divisions that were moving west, the two sides would become heavily involved in fighting around the village of Stonne. The village was located on the heavily wooded Mont Dieu, which was a high ridge about 15 kilometers to the south of Sedan, and the one that presented both sides with a relatively commanding position. Stonne was located at the steepest part of the ridge, and it would be the focus of the fighting in the days that followed. Over the course of May 15th through 17th, the village itself would change hands around 17 times, with the fighting devolving into the kind of positional slugfest that would not have been out of place during the First World War. The fighting was purely a consequence of the failure of the French to launch a counterattack, though, because this was one of the areas that the French counterattack forces had been dispersed to once the attack on the 14th had been cancelled. The units who had moved into this area had occupied a variety of positions around Stonne, including within the village itself, with the goal of preventing any further German advances. They would be tested early in the day on May 15th when the first German units of the Großdeutschland Regiment attacked with the support of tanks of the 8th Panzer Regiment. What happened next was a fitting introduction to the fighting that followed, because as the German tanks moved forward in a column, they would quickly lose 7 tanks. This damage was done by just a few French anti-tank guns that had been positioned to protect the advances or the approaches into Stonne. One of these anti-tank guns would quickly knock out 3 Panzer IVs as soon as they started to approach. Even with these successes, the French defenders were heavily outnumbered and outgunned, and the Germans would continue to attack, eventually pushing into Stonne at 8 a.m. Then the two sides would fight over the village for most of the morning, with control passing back and forth several times in the hours that followed. In one of these instances, at around 11 a.m., a strong force of French tanks of 3 different tank battalions would be joined by infantry forces in a counterattack. At that time, Stonne was held only by some infantry forces from Großdeutschland, and they had brought up a total of 9 anti-tank guns. There was just one problem. Those anti-tank guns were not powerful enough to stop the French Char Bs. The Char Bs were not the only tanks in the attack, and some of the more lightly armored French tanks were at risk, but the presence of the massive and seemingly invincible Chars sort of caused a serious crisis of confidence among the German infantry. The presence of the French tanks and the lack of a counterstroke from the Germans would result in the French retaking the village once again. But then a large portion of those French tanks were pulled out of the area around Stonne during the afternoon because of Flavigny's attempts to concentrate his forces for the counterattack that was supposed to happen, but would not happen. This then allowed the Germans to retake the village, as the French tank forces had been a major reason that they'd been able to hold on to their gains in the first place. The fighting around Stonne would follow in the days after the 15th, with it primarily being an infantry fight as French and German reinforcements arrived, including the newly arrived 16th and 24th German infantry divisions. By the time that these new forces arrived, they could see the impact of the fighting that had already occurred, with buildings damaged and the remains of over 50 French and German tanks scattered in and around Stonne. While it was another French defeat, I think it's a pretty good example of how well the French forces could fight if they were properly prepared, if they were properly in position, and if they were properly supported by tanks, by artillery, and other types of firepower. They had inflicted serious losses on the German forces that they had fought at Stonne, but unfortunately this tactical victory was not a success that could turn the course of a campaign, and the campaign was already rapidly spiraling completely out of control for the French.